Hello, welcome to another Museum FAQ video. I'm Paul Orselli, President and Chief Instigator of POW, Paul Orselli Workshop, and I'm delighted to be joined today by Isabella Bruno. We're going to be talking, I'm now picking sort of thematic Zoom backgrounds, so we're really concerned about radical reimaginings and the future of museums and the possibilities of museums. But before we launch into that interesting conversation, hello, Isabella.
Hello.
I would love it if you could. I always like to have people start out and tell us a little bit about their background, sort of how they got to where they are now. So if you could give us your story a little bit, and then we can start the radical reimagining a little bit.
All right. So my background is a windy journey. My bachelor's is actually in dance with a focus in choreography, and from that degree, I actually started working in architecture, which I did for a few years, and then managed to land at ESI Design, which is where I was really exposed to the field of exhibition design and the possibility of designing for a museum context. After trapseeing around a little bit in some more architecture contexts, I ended up going to FIT, so the Fashion Institute of Technology, where I got a master's in exhibit design, and then graduated at the tail end of the recession, and ended up doing a lot of freelance work for a bit. Paul knows about my foray into pop-up projects and empty storefronts, and then ended up working at the National 9/11 Memorial Museum for a few years. And currently I'm based in DC, where I work at Smithsonian's National Museum of American History. And in between that, a little bit of performance art and some interesting experiences in between.
Well, that's great. I was going to say you embody the phrase "dancing about architecture." Didn't Laurie Anderson say writing about music is like dancing about architecture or something? So,
yeah, it's funny. I've also heard that Martha Graham said that. So I don't know, who knows actually said it.
we have to talk about Martha Graham. My wife's grandmother was one of Martha Graham's original dancers. So
really,
yeah. So
wow.
got the pictures and the books to prove it. So anyway, but that's another conversation.
Yes.
So that's great. You are coming at this conversation in just the right way. Not only do you have lots of lenses to look at the world through experientially and your background, but as I said before we started recording, I always appreciate a fellow troublemaker. So that's part of why I think I'm interested in having you for this conversation to talk about where museums could be going and the future of museums. And here we are in this pandemic moment where people are really thinking about, whoa, what's going to happen to museums and what can museums be? And it seems to me that many museums and museum people, instead of taking this moment as an opportunity to do things differently, they may even be going backwards a little bit and just saying, well, if we just add more sanitizer stations and maybe take away those touch screens and things people touch, well, that'll be great. That'll help get us open. So I would like to not start there, but I would like to hear you. I know you've been thinking about this for not just now, but for a while. And I'd just be interested to get your thoughts from sort of the 30,000 foot view of where, from your perspective, what kinds of things museums and museum folks, museum workers should really be thinking about, and the opportunities that there are to make museums even better,
Yeah.
instead of just making museums sort of a watered down version of their previous selves before the pandemic hit. So that that's a lot of that gives you a lot of latitude to start the conversation, Isabella, but you are up to the task, no doubt. So
I can do it. Yeah, let's get into it. Um, yeah, I for a long time, I have been following the work of Elizabeth Merritt and the Center for the Future of Museums, and have been a big fan of the voice that she brings to the museum field. And about less than a year ago, started talking to Suse Anderson about an idea for a kind of a creative mornings-like series that would be based in DC, that would be geared around creating a playground for us to think imaginatively about what the future of museums could be. And the idea in its condensed form was basically to invite some colleagues of mine who are at Smithsonian, so at any unit, and very generally open enough to anybody in the DC area, but for Suse particularly, to be able to invite her students, so like connecting generations, to a morning series where we would invite provocations from people outside our fields and our field, and they would posit some possibilities, some possible vision of the future related to a theme. So the example that I've given is the future of floods. So let's say you have a climate scientist who talks about flooding possibilities on coastlines 100 years from now, 50 years from now. And then you could have a risk analyst from the insurance industry talking about how they're projecting flooding will affect their field, and thereby museums, obviously. And then maybe lastly, you have a water management engineer, civil engineer, talk about city infrastructure and water management, and they all kind of present these possible visions of how they are thinking about and anticipating what the future might be, let's say 50 years from now. And then after those short kind of presentations, we'd get into groups and we would develop responses to those possible scenarios together, collaboratively. And we would talk through the implications of what it might mean if we are regularly having to respond to flood scenarios. DC and Smithsonian itself is on a floodplain, so we have to think about that already. And so what if we were thinking about it more and more holistically, and not just segmented by our roles in our institutions, right? So then we would, come up with these possible responses, and we would talk about them, and then we would enjoy the ways that different people approach the solution, and probably very imaginatively ways. The idea of everyone moving around in canoes has occurred to me. So what does it mean to have, a loading dock when it's by canoe? So, things like that. And it seemed like a really, had a lot of possibilities for being useful and in application in the work environment. It would be very stimulating to working professionals and future emerging professionals. And then also was, playful. And so this was just a way that it seemed like, some futures thinking could be brought into the museum context and become a set of tools that people could learn from, learn to use. And then the pandemic hit. And so everything kind of got tabled for a little bit. And then I started thinking about the possibility of another, like a pivot, a different version of the ways that we could use thinking about the future to foster play and creativity and perhaps even resilience. a little bit. And so that's kind of where I am right now.
So that, of course, sounds great to me.
The first idea?
Yeah, no, well, just the idea of playing out those scenarios and bringing people from outside the field and deliberately sort of pushing the boundaries of thinking about museums' place in the world, places in the world.
Yeah.
Now, not just because you are enmeshed in a gigantic museum system where you work
Right.
now in Washington, D.C., not to mention all the other museums beyond and sort of places, cultural arts places beyond the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C. I'm just wondering how you would respond. You know, there will be people, maybe just like there are museum people now, who sort of want to embrace, yeah, great, what can we do to think bigger about museums, think differently about museums? But then there are people who, let's say, maybe won't embrace that so well, and maybe that doesn't matter. But I'm just curious, you know, what do you think can come out of that sort of visualizing and working with people across different fields?
Mhm.
That there are lots of folks in the museum. Well, I'll just say some folks in the museum business who I can imagine the devil's advocate voices coming up and saying, yeah, that's great, you know, to think about, yeah, Washington's on a floodplain, or Miami, you know, is a museum city, and they have to be concerned about flooding and water in the future and stuff. But what does that mean for me right now? What do I,
Yeah.
how's this going to help? How's this going to help me move my museum forward now? And maybe that's not the right question, but I just, like I say, I think that, as always, and maybe not just in museums, you always have this dichotomy. You have people who are sort of flexible thinkers wanting to move forward, and then you have people who are like the keepers of the flame. Well, wait, don't move too fast. You're going to lose us. So I just be curious how you react to that notion, and you can feel free to say, I don't like that notion, Paul. But
No, I think I've got a decent response, which is that you know, it takes all kinds. Like we do need the people who value tradition, and we need people who have a deep connection to the legacy of our institution. You can't underestimate the power of institutional knowledge, but I think what is um, attracts me and I think is useful about thinking about the future in a way that becomes a practice is the idea of embracing uncertainty and seeking clarity instead of certainty. So, you know, the idea of being able to hone in on what you're actually pursuing, so that it becomes something that can actually be a vision or a goal that everyone in an organization can remember at any given time, much less mention, versus certainty, which is often false. You know, certainty can often be based on something like best practice, which to me is a misnomer. It doesn't really exist. I mean, people hate when I say that, but I really believe it, because what is best practice but a fixed way of looking at a shifting set of problems, right? You know, there's certain things that might be principles, but I don't know if they're best practice, because practice assumes that it's something that you have to keep doing. It's iterative, right? So anyway, to get back to the idea of clarity over certainty, I think that that's at the core of what looking at the future is, because you're not actually trying to project. It's very different than you know, what I mentioned earlier about the risk analyst, right? Like that is a set of projections and often uses statistical analysis to measure risk. Futures is more focused on developing a set of intuition meters so that you can determine what is possible, what is plausible, and what is preferable. So the reason why you define what is possible or plausible is so that then you can begin to shift to what is preferable. And that's why it's useful in strategy, and that's why it gives you more certainty, is because you have to ask yourself over and over again, how might this be, okay, so this is a possibility based on these push and pull factors that we've identified. To use the flood example, like rising sea levels, we know it's happening. Eventually the coast of the United States is going to shrink by a certain percentage. So if we know that, then that's very plausible. So then what is the preferable future that comes out of that? Just because the coastlines are eroding doesn't mean that the Perez Art Museum has to close up shop. Maybe there are other ways that they can think of the implication of that rising coastline. And so that offers you clarity. It doesn't offer you certainty, because you don't actually know what the nature of that rising coastline will be, but it allows you to then figure out what you want to do, how you need to move towards that preferable outcome that you want to have in that possibility. So I think it's a very useful way of thinking about what comes next and how we get there. It is a given that in futures you're talking about multiplicity. You're talking about multiple possibilities. You're never, ever, ever just talking about one. Why? You wouldn't do that because, again, that's projection. That's kind of narrowing your options instead of looking at how you can prepare for many. So yeah.
So there's that constant tug between looking for certainty and looking for flexibility.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it strikes me maybe actually your background in dance might actually be an advantage to you for this. I mean, that you have to have a sort of foundation of technique and a sort of knowledge of yourself and your surroundings when you're doing that. But there also is some inherent flexibility as you're working with other people and what have you.
Yeah.
This sort of tug and pull between looking for certainty, which is, as you well know, something that comes up a lot in museum thinking, but also this need for flexibility, which this moment certainly thrusts upon us. We might have ideas about what's going to happen after museums reopen here in North America. We're seeing some initial starts in other parts of the world, and so we might be able to learn from that. But how this, now we're getting a little bit down from the 30,000 foot view to a little closer to ground level here. What are some things as you're thinking about your own practice and this notion of flexibility and the real need for flexibility as we move forward short term? Like what kinds of things would you have people, or are you thinking about that you think would be useful for other people to think about on how you can sort of hold those those things in tension, looking for certainty, not only us, our visitors, but also the need for flexibility. I mean, if we're too rigid when we reopen and then we see things don't work, that's just not gonna play out. So I'd be interested in your thoughts about how maybe you keep that in yourself, in your practice, and maybe things for people to think about in terms of both the need for certainty and the simultaneous need for flexibility?
Yeah, so I've found myself over the time period of the quarantine and the pandemic finding a lot of comfort in various forms of community. And, these are from all different areas of my life, a parent group here for working parents, um, a community based around different forms of facilitation, but these virtual communities have meant a lot to me, and it made me realize that I would benefit, and I assumed that some other museum um, professionals and lovers would benefit from ways to gather together and perhaps radically imagine what museums could be. And since I've been really interested in future stuff, and there's always the influence of speculative fiction in the practice of thinking about the future. It occurred to me that maybe there's a way that we could gather together and begin to train and foster a community of radical imagination about museum futures. And to me, that would possibly just live in the context of starting from some speculative world like Star Trek or Wakanda, or Madeline L'Engle's planets, and using that drawn vision from those authors and those creators, and then extrapolating our own thoughts about what a museum might be in that place and time. And so by using alternate realities and beginning to map out visions of museums there, who do they serve? What are they preserving? What are they presenting? What is their function in society, and what does society, ask them to be in those worlds? Then we might begin to kind of flex our muscles in this really enjoyable, fulfilling, imaginative way, where we're not burdened by the limitations of what museums are able to be or seem possible to be right now. But maybe we can build our muscles in terms of what they can be in the future. And I don't know, it just seems like a really fun idea. And I've talked to a few people about it, and I'm going to be kind of putting it out on the Twitterverse and seeing who grabs. And I don't think it's for everyone. I know that we're in a really horribly difficult time with layoffs and instability and furloughs. But for those people who want to turn their grief into something that's kind of a cathartic creative act, maybe this will fill that need for them. And I hope that they'll join us.
Well, that may actually be the way to thread that needle between the need for certainty and the need for flexibility, in the sense that really maybe the point is to delve into the process and to really let go of this sort of constant tug of, okay, so but what does this mean for museums right now, and just leave
Yeah.
that be.
Yeah.
And if there are things that people pull out of that for right now, and things that are deliberately very whether it's institutional memory or institutional operations, that those are sort of side benefits, but the primary benefit is really just letting go of that, and letting our imaginations fly with the possibilities, without that constant tug of, well, what does this mean for operations, or what does this mean for fundraising, or what does this mean for
Yes.
the current mission? Because the current mission might not have anything to do with the future or any of those other things too. So that's really interesting. I think that and the idea of working with speculative fiction and, you know, deliberately something that doesn't have necessarily anything immediately to do with museums as a jumping off point. That's a really interesting approach. I think that's great.
Yeah, and it's still a built world, you know, it's still going to have forces that would impact what museums would be. So I just, yeah, I think it's got a lot of potential and joy in it. And the other thing is that I think we just don't talk about museums being defined as being a creative space. You know, we talk about museums being we preserve, we display, we educate. Maybe every once in a while we say we engage.
I guess it depends on the museum you're talking about.
I know, but ICOM didn't put that in their, you know, Kyoto stuff. So there we go. But what my argument is that, you know, anytime you are doing some form of creative destruction, you're taking something out of its existing context, you're preserving an object that wants to fall apart naturally by its material nature. You are, you know, combining, you know, discordant things that weren't originally together. That is a form of creative destruction. And that's what we do. It's a beautiful thing, but that is what we do. And it's a creative act. And I would love to hear more often that we are creative and that we are creators in what we do. And I think doing some exercise like, you know, making a collage or writing a short story or a storyboard or a mini play that expresses what it would feel like to work in a museum, you know, on the moon. I gotta get a better planet than that. Not even a planet. And that'll be a way to maybe kickstart that process.
Cool. Well, that maybe that's a good way to end the conversation right now. I'd love it, Isabella, if
are you going to sign up, Paul?
What's that?
You're going to sign up?
Oh, you know, I'm in for things like that for sure. Right. The thing I was going to say is I would love to be able to include, to almost create a little radical reimagining resource list, or a couple of links or resources that we can suggest to people. We can put, I'm always like, we can put them in the description below. So I think that would be great. And then also, if we can include some ways for people either to contact you or your Twitter handle, because I know you're active on Twitter, for people to sort of connect with you. And some people who, you know, are like, hey, I'm in the DC area, or I'm close to the DC area, and that sounds like a great idea. So that,
well, the great news is you can be from anywhere.
Well, that's true.
Yeah.
As we found out through the wonders of Zoom and all these things that already existed, but now have become so commonplace in our lives. So, well, I really appreciate you taking the time, Isabella. You what I love about these conversations is after they're over, I think, I gotta think about that a little bit more. So that's I think that's the mark of successful reimagining, or successful troublemaking, or successful creativity, however you want to frame that. So again, I really appreciate you taking the time.
And I thank you for inviting me to talk about this early, young idea.
Okay, terrific. Well, take care, and hopefully our paths cross at some nebulous point in the future. in
Yeah.
person.
Yeah,
So,
that would be great.
okay, take care.
Bye, be well.